Imagine a vast, churning canvas of gray-green water, stretching endlessly to a horizon that seems to swallow the sky whole. This is the North Atlantic in March 1943, a battleground where the fate of nations hung by the thinnest of threads. On one side, the Allied convoys, fragile lifelines laden with the raw materials of war, food, fuel, munitions, desperately needed to keep Britain alive and launch the fight against Nazi tyranny. On the other, a silent, unseen menace. The German U-boat, commanded by Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, whose submarine fleet had become the embodiment of oceanic terror. That month alone, an astonishing 108 Allied ships vanished beneath the waves, testament to the ruthless efficiency of these underwater predators. The cries of desperation from Allied command were palpable. Some whispered that German victory in the Atlantic was not just possible, but imminent. Lose the Atlantic, and Britain starves, Britain falls, and with it, perhaps, the entire war effort. Yet, just 2 short months later, that terrifying tide would turn with a brutal, almost unbelievable swiftness. By May 1943, it wouldn't be the merchantmen limping home in defeat, but the U-boats themselves, their crews shattered, their morale broken. How could such a dramatic reversal occur? How did the hunter become the hunted in the deadliest game ever played beneath the waves? This isn't just a story of technology or tactics. It's a saga of human ingenuity, resilience, and the sheer, unyielding will to survive against an enemy that seemed unstoppable. It's about how the collective despair of March transformed into the grim determination of May, forging a victory that didn't just save a convoy, but fundamentally altered the course of World War II. From the very dawn of the war in 1939, German U-boats had cast a long, ominous shadow across the Atlantic. While surface raiders certainly played their part in the initial stages, it was Admiral Karl Dönitz, a visionary and fanatical believer in submarine warfare, who envisioned a strategy of tonnage war. His goal was brutally simple: sink enough British merchant shipping to either cripple the United Kingdom's military capacity beyond repair, or, in his wildest dreams, starve London into outright surrender. Initially, his vision seemed to be bearing terrifying fruit. The summer of 1940, a period Dönitz himself chillingly dubbed the happy time, saw his U-boats operate with frightening impunity. They preyed on isolated merchantmen, often unescorted or inadequately protected, sending 471 vessels to the bottom. The U-boat crews, many of them young, zealous, and fiercely loyal to the Führer, reveled in this era of seemingly effortless destruction. Their torpedoes found targets with grim regularity, and the ocean became their hunting ground. When the United States was dragged into the conflict in 1942 after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the happy time returned, intensified, and even more deadly. This period was chillingly referred to by the U-boat crews as the second happy time, or even American shooting season. The expansion of the war meant more targets, and a vast, largely unprotected American coastline initially proved fertile hunting grounds for Dönitz's wolfpacks. By the end of 1942, a staggering 1,160 ships had been sunk, a truly catastrophic loss for the Allies. For British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, a man who understood the strategic imperatives of maritime power better than perhaps any other wartime leader, the Atlantic was not merely a theater of war. It was the critical theater, the foundational pillar upon which all other fronts depended. Without control of the Atlantic, everything else crumbled. By late 1942, his anxieties were reaching fever pitch. The U-boat menace remained one of the few areas where Germany maintained a decisive, terrifying offensive. The sheer scale of the threat was brought home in November 1942, when U-boats alone accounted for the sinking of 768,000 gross tons of Allied shipping, a peak for the entire war. This was not just a military setback. It was a psychological blow, a constant reminder of Britain's vulnerability, its dependence on those vital sea lanes. Churchill, ever the master of propaganda and morale, understood the power of language. He issued new, very specific guidelines for how the German submarine threat was to be referenced. They were not to be called submarines. That term, he decreed, was to be reserved exclusively for Allied underwater vessels, the gallant and noble craft which sink theirs. German U-boats, on the other hand, were to be unequivocally branded as dastardly villains who sink our ships. It was a small but significant move, designed to reinforce the image of an implacable enemy, to dehumanize them, and to inspire a collective resolve against their ruthless depredations. This linguistic distinction, as recounted by author Clay Blair in his extensive history of the U-boat war, underscores the profound psychological warfare being waged alongside the naval battles. The gravity of the situation was undeniable. At the Casablanca Conference in January 1943, a crucial meeting between Allied leaders, American strategists finally conceded to prioritize the Atlantic. This was a monumental decision, as it meant delaying the much-anticipated invasion of France and Germany until 1944. While some commanders, eager to strike directly at the heart of the Third Reich, accepted this reluctantly, others understood with chilling clarity that it was utterly impossible to use the United Kingdom as a staging base for such an invasion if the U-boat threat continued to fester like an open wound. The logistical nightmare, the immense losses of troop transports and supply ships, would have rendered any cross-channel operation suicidal. But even with promises of increased U.S. support, the challenges remained formidable. Across the vast, multinational Allied effort, there was constant, fierce competition for scarce resources. Every destroyer, every long-range patrol plane, every piece of advanced technology was in high demand, pulled in multiple directions by the demands of different theaters and commanders. Meanwhile, Dönitz, far from being diminished, was actually strengthening his hand. In 1939, he had started with a mere 39 submarines, a small but growing fleet. By early 1943, that number had swelled to approximately 300 operational U-boats, with more pouring out of German shipyards at an alarming rate. And then, a pivotal change at the top. When Grand Admiral Erich Raeder resigned as Navy Commander-in-Chief in January 1943, Hitler, impressed by Dönitz's unwavering commitment and the U-boat's perceived successes, promoted him to the ultimate naval position. This was a commander who lived and breathed submarines. Hitler, ever the man of grand pronouncements, urged Dönitz to maintain the relentless pressure in the Atlantic. But Dönitz, for all his fanaticism, possessed a chilling realism. In a radio broadcast, he soberly acknowledged, "The harsh realities of the submarine war means that even more difficult times lie ahead of us." This wasn't a boast, but a grim assessment, a recognition that the fight was far from over, and that the stakes were higher than ever. With a submariner now at the helm of the entire German Navy, the Allies could only brace themselves for an intensification of the U-boat menace. The stakes had never been higher, and the gray waters of the Atlantic braced themselves for the storm. One of the most terrifying vulnerabilities for Allied convoys was a vast, unforgiving expanse of ocean known as the Mid-Atlantic Air Gap. This was a favored hunting ground for U-boats, a strategic blind spot that Allied seamen grimly dubbed Torpedo Junction. Imagine sailing for days, the comforting drone of an aircraft engine overhead, a constant companion, a vigilant protector against the unseen enemy. Then, suddenly, silence. The plane turns back, its fuel or range exhausted, leaving a terrifying void stretching for up to 1,000 kilometers off the treacherous Cape of Farewell. In this gap, convoys were naked, vulnerable, utterly at the mercy of the wolfpacks. By 1943, thanks in no small part to the heroic and massive expansion of the Royal Canadian Navy, Allied warships could often provide end-to-end escort for convoys. But even these diligent escorts, though growing in number and experience, were too few and remained critically vulnerable without the essential umbrella of air support. Air bases in the UK, Iceland, the US, and Canada had been steadily improving their coverage, but that stubborn gap persisted, a gaping maw in the Atlantic defenses. Allied commanders were desperately trying to close this gap. One key solution was the deployment of escort carriers, smaller, often retrofitted civilian vessels hastily converted to launch and recover aircraft at sea. These floating airfields were crucial, but they were still in their infancy and limited in number. Another hope lay with very long-range, VLR bombers, aircraft like the formidable B-24 Liberator, capable of extended patrols. However, until January 1943, British Coastal Command, the primary guardian of the Atlantic air lanes, possessed a paltry 6 VLR Liberators. The vast majority of these precious long-range aircraft were diverted elsewhere, primarily to the relentless bomber offensive against Germany's industrial heartland, or to the sprawling, equally demanding war in the Pacific. The Atlantic, though critical, was constantly battling for resources with other high-priority theaters. Adding to the Allied woes, the German Navy's Beobachtungsdienst intelligence service, their signals intelligence unit, had achieved a significant breakthrough in December 1941. They had successfully cracked the British naval cipher No. 3. This wasn't a minor exploit. It was a game-changer. By intercepting and decrypting British communications, German U-boat command could anticipate convoy routes, timings, and compositions. They could then precisely orchestrate their dreaded group attacks, deploying their wolfpacks with chilling accuracy. This advantage meant that U-boats were locating about 70% of Allied convoys, not by chance or sheer luck, but thanks to the precise, devastating power of code breaking. The enemy wasn't just searching. They were being directed. And if the operational challenges weren't enough, Allied resources were further strained by major strategic diversions. The 1942 Operation Torch landings in North Africa and the subsequent battle for Tunisia in early 1943 siphoned off immense naval power. The Royal Navy, for instance, diverted a staggering 125 destroyers and other vital escort ships to support Torch. The sheer fuel demands for these extensive African operations meant that the precious North Atlantic convoys often had less fuel to spare, limiting their ability to execute evasive maneuvers and outrun or outwit the U-boat packs. The cumulative effect of these factors was a terrifying surge in sinkings in early 1943. In March alone, German U-boats and surface raiders combined to sink 120 Allied ships globally, a total of 704,000 tons. Of this, a staggering 484,000 tons vanished beneath the waves of the Atlantic. This rapid, dramatic increase in tonnage sunk, a terrifying 74% over the previous month, was understandably perceived by many as a major existential crisis. A British memorandum issued in March 1943 painted a stark, almost apocalyptic picture. There is insufficient shipping to allow us to develop the offensives against the enemy, which have been decided on. Every ship sunk makes the situation worse. We can no longer rely on evading the U-boat packs, and hence, we shall have to fight the convoys through them. The tone was one of grim resignation, acknowledging that defensive measures were no longer enough. A direct, brutal confrontation was inevitable. A December 1943 Allied report, looking back at this period, even went so far as to suggest that victory in the Atlantic, and by extension, the entire war, had been genuinely threatened. The fear was real, palpable, and rooted in the very real losses piling up. However, historical perspective and more recent research have begun to nuance this dramatic narrative, questioning the very idea of an absolute crisis in March. It seems the perceived March crisis largely hinged on the disproportionate losses suffered by just 2 specific convoys, which accounted for 22 out of the 90 merchant vessels sunk in the Atlantic during that period. While these individual losses were catastrophic for those involved, they don't necessarily reflect the overall trend. In fact, when we look at the broader picture, only 31% of March convoys were actually attacked, a significantly lower figure than the 52% attacked in November 1942, a period also marked by heavy losses, but not often described with the same crisis rhetoric. Furthermore, in the first quarter of 1943, total sinkings were actually lower than any single quarter of 1942. Perhaps most crucially, the Allies were building ships at an astonishing rate, particularly in American shipyards. By March 1943, despite the heavy losses, there was a net gain of 2 million gross tons in Allied shipping capacity. The logistical pipelines, though strained, were not broken. What's even more telling is the perspective from the German side. There is nothing in German archival sources, no jubilant communiques from Dönitz or Hitler, that portrays March as a moment of imminent, decisive victory. Quite the opposite. This suggests that while the Allies felt the sting of their losses keenly, the Germans themselves did not perceive this as the turning point they so desperately craved. Indeed, the ultimate irony of history would reveal itself within 2 months, as the very U-boats that had terrorized the Atlantic would be forced to withdraw in undeniable, crushing defeat. The crisis was perhaps more a perception of immediate, concentrated pain than an accurate reflection of the strategic balance. Just as these intense convoy battles were raging, almost prophetically, the Allies were already taking decisive action. In early 1943, the Atlantic Convoy Conference convened, a pivotal meeting where Allied naval leaders ironed out crucial details to better pool their resources and standardize their procedures. The top priority, unequivocally, was to close that dreaded mid-Atlantic air gap and, crucially, to shift from a purely defensive posture to taking the fight directly to the U-boats. The Commander-in-Chief of Western Approaches, the naval area responsible for protecting convoys entering British waters, expressed a newfound optimism that resonated throughout the command structure. "I really have hopes now that we can turn from the defensive to another and better role, killing them." It was a declaration of intent, a psychological shift from merely surviving to actively hunting. The early months of 1943 thus witnessed a perfect storm of tactical, technological, and military developments, all coming to fruition around the same critical time. While many popular accounts emphasize 1 or 2 key factors, it was truly the convergence of multiple advancements that proved decisive. Undoubtedly, ultra-intelligence, derived from the painstakingly cracked German Enigma code, is the most well-known and often romanticized tool available to the Allies. The stories of Bletchley Park and the brilliant minds working there are legendary, and for good reason. Ultra could provide a general, strategic location of most U-boats, allowing the dedicated men and women in London's submarine tracking room to plot their movements with a degree of accuracy previously unimaginable. This allowed convoys to be rerouted, often by hundreds of miles, around known wolfpack concentrations, an immensely effective tactic that saved countless lives and ships. However, it's crucial to understand that Ultra, while vital, was by no means the sole solution, or even the most important in every tactical situation. Its intelligence was often slow. It could sometimes take up to 72 hours to decrypt German communications, meaning that by the time the information reached a convoy, the U-boats might have moved, or an attack could already be underway. There were also periodic blackouts when the Germans, suspecting compromise or simply changing their settings, altered their Enigma keys, rendering Allied decryption efforts temporarily blind, a terrifying reality that persisted for almost all of 1942. And as the sheer number of U-boats at sea continued to increase, the statistical likelihood of evading them, even with Ultra's guidance, naturally decreased. So, while Ultra was indispensable as a broader strategic tool, guiding high-level decisions and convoy routing, it could not, on its own, pinpoint a U-boat preparing to launch a torpedo spread in real time. That's where a host of other critical technologies came into play. By early 1943, a growing number of Allied escorts were being equipped with dramatically improved sonar and radar equipment. ASDIC, the British equivalent of sonar, was the primary underwater detection system. Imagine a sailor in a dimly lit compartment, hunched over a hydrophone, listening intently to the eerie, repetitive ping, ping, ping sound. That ping, a pulse of sound emitted by the ship, would travel through the water, strike a submerged U-boat, and return as a pong. The time difference between the ping and the pong revealed the U-boat's range and bearing. These new ASDIC systems were more sensitive, more accurate, allowing escorts to detect submerged U-boats at greater distances and more reliably. But it wasn't just about detection. This improved accuracy allowed for the far more effective deployment of anti-submarine weapons, like the deadly Hedgehog mortar, which fired a pattern of contact-fused projectiles ahead of the ship, and the ever-present depth charges, devastating explosions designed to crush a U-boat hull under immense water pressure. Meanwhile, a revolution was occurring on the surface and in the air. Ships, and crucially, aircraft, were now being fitted with new 10-centimeter wavelength radar. This was a breakthrough. Earlier radars, using longer wavelengths, were often prone to interference from sea clutter and less effective at detecting small targets. The 10-centimeter radar, however, was incredibly precise. It could detect a surfaced U-boat, often running on its diesel engines to recharge batteries, from many miles away, even in darkness or thick fog. This was a critical vulnerability for U-boats, which spent a significant amount of time on the surface. None of these individual tools were perfect on their own. Each had its limitations. But when combined, when used in concert, they began to weave a near-impenetrable network of defenses around the convoys. A vivid first-hand account perfectly encapsulates this synergy, the terrifying ballet of hunt and escape. Imagine a destroyer in the blackness of a North Atlantic night. The first indication of a U-boat attack would be from the ASDIC people, a veteran sailor recounted, who would pick up a contact. You could hear these pings, and the difference between the ping and the pong is the distance how far the submarine is away. When they think they're right over the top of the submarine, the order is fire. That means the depth charges go. A colossal volume of water would come up. It was almost like lightning going across the water. In daytime, it's a fantastic thing to see. This was the terrifying reality for the U-boat crews. The silent hunters suddenly becoming the hunted. German submariner Anton Staller, serving aboard U-188, experienced this terror directly in March 1943. A harrowing tale that provides a stark contrast to the Allied perspective. His account plunges us into the suffocating, claustrophobic world inside a U-boat under attack. Alarm bells shrilled loudly. "Destroyer on the starboard bow! Range about 5,000 meters, and a quick glance at the manometer showed me that we were at 100 meters. At the same instant, for the first time, I heard ahead of us the roar of exploding depth charges. Now I discovered how appalling loud these sounded underwater. Though fearful, I concentrated on my hydrophone, wondering if I would ever hear anything again in my life. This wasn't just noise. It was a physical assault. The concussions slamming through the steel hull, threatening to tear the boat apart. The very air vibrating with destructive force. For the men inside, every explosion was a gamble with death, a test of nerves and the U-boat's structural integrity. Stoller's words convey the absolute terror, the sensory overload, and the profound, gut-wrenching fear that was the constant companion of any U-boat crew caught by an alert escort. Another crucial Allied development that amplified their offensive capabilities was high-frequency/direction finding, known universally as HFDF, or simply Huff-Duff. This was a revolutionary technology that could detect German U-boat radio communications, even very brief ones, out to an impressive range of 25 kilometers. Imagine a U-boat commander on the surface, making a quick radio report to Dönitz's headquarters, or communicating with another U-boat in his wolfpack. He might think his transmission is fleeting, undetectable. But with Huff-Duff, the Allied escort could instantly get a bearing on that transmission, and critically, it was close enough to immediately pursue and attack. This capability dramatically outranged surface radar for initial detection, allowing escorts to be far more proactive. The technology itself had existed since 1942, but by 1943, it became widely available, with at least 2 Huff-Duff-equipped ships assigned to every convoy. This meant the U-boat's primary means of coordinating their dreaded wolfpack attacks, their radio communications, now became their Achilles heel, a beacon guiding their hunters. Alongside these technological marvels came more powerful anti-submarine weapons, and just as importantly, better tactical organization. Previously, a standard escort group of 6 warships was considered adequate to protect a convoy of 24 merchantmen. However, civilian experts, notably Professor P.M.S. Blackett, a brilliant physicist turned operational researcher, conducted groundbreaking analyses that demonstrated a revolutionary insight. 8 escorts could protect 48 merchant ships just as effectively. This seemingly simple mathematical adjustment had profound implications. By combining smaller convoys into larger ones, it not only presented a more formidable target to the U-boats, but also, crucially, freed up a significant number of escorts. These newly available warships were then organized into highly effective mobile support groups, which could be detached from their regular convoy duties and dispatched to assist specific convoys under heavy attack, reinforcing defenses and turning the tide in crucial battles. This was a flexible, aggressive strategy, a shift from static defense to dynamic offense. And finally, the mid-Atlantic air gap, that terrifying blind spot, was at last beginning to close. The steady flow of very long-range bombers and, critically, escort carriers into the Atlantic theater was finally making a difference. By May 1943, British Coastal Command, which had once struggled with a handful of VLR aircraft, now boasted 49 of these formidable bombers, a substantial increase from the 17 they possessed in February. While this number still seemed dwarfed by the hundreds of heavy bombers pulverizing German industry, it was, significantly, enough to effectively close the air gap. Aircraft like the American B-24 Liberator, the British Whitley bombers, and the iconic Sunderland and Catalina flying boats, with their long endurance and powerful weaponry, became vital submarine killers. They could patrol for hours, using their new radar to detect surfaced U-boats and then unleashing a devastating array of depth charges, bombs, and even rockets. These aerial hunters rapidly accounted for roughly half of all U-boat losses. The convergence of these factors, intelligent use of ultra, devastatingly effective new detection technologies, ASTIC, 10-centimeter radar, Huff-Duff, brilliant tactical reorganization, and the long-sought closure of the air gap, created a synergistic, overwhelming force that the U-boats, despite their numbers, simply could not withstand. The Atlantic was about to witness its most dramatic reversal. The combination of these new tools and tactics was utterly devastating to the German U-boat fleet. The shift wasn't instantaneous, but the signs of impending doom were clear. In April 1943, the battle began to balance out, a grim foreshadowing of what was to come. The Allies lost 39 merchantmen, a painful toll, but in return, they sank 15 U-boats, a significant increase in German losses that started to ring alarm bells in Dönitz's headquarters. But May 1943, forever etched in the annals of naval warfare, would prove to be the decisive, cataclysmic month, forever known as Black May to the Kriegsmarine. A pivotal moment, almost a microcosm of the entire turning tide, was the harrowing voyage of convoy SC-130. This convoy, comprising 37 merchantmen bound for Liverpool from Halifax, Nova Scotia, was a vital artery of supply. What made it different, however, was its formidable escort. 8 warships, several of which were equipped with the very latest high-frequency direction-finding, Huff-Duff, and the new, highly effective 10-centimeter radar. These weren't just ships, they were integrated platforms of sophisticated detection and destruction. German naval intelligence, still riding the wave of its earlier code-breaking successes, identified the convoy and, with characteristic aggression, gathered an astonishing force of up to 25 U-boats, arrayed in 3 powerful wolfpacks. Donau 1 and 2 approached from the southeast, while Wolfpack Iller was already lurking in the area. Their plan was precise and deadly: to attack the convoy exactly within the mid-Atlantic air gap, the perceived Achilles' heel of Allied defenses. However, unknown to the Germans, British ultra-intelligence was fully aware of this U-boat concentration and their intentions. But in a cruel twist of fate, a system failure, a breakdown in communication, meant that this critical, real-time intelligence was not passed to the escort commander on the ground. It was a momentary lapse that could have cost the Allies dearly. Even without that specific ultra-warning, the battle for SC-130, which opened on May 18th, unfolded as a testament to the new Allied capabilities and the newfound aggression of their escorts. Instead of passively defending, the escort groups conducted proactive sweeps for the U-boats, using their Huff-Duff and radar to locate the lurking predators before they could even launch their attacks. They spoiled torpedo runs with aggressive maneuvers, forcing U-boats to dive prematurely. The convoy itself, now well practiced in defensive maneuvers, executed evasive turns with increasing skill. Soon, the battle moved within the range of approaching Allied aircraft, the VLR bombers and escort carrier planes that were finally closing the air gap. These aerial hunters hounded the U-boats relentlessly, forcing them to submerge and denying them the precious surface time needed to pursue, organize, and recharge batteries. By May 21st, after days of continuous brutal engagement, U-boat command, facing overwhelming losses and a complete failure to penetrate the convoy's defenses, was forced to abandon the attack in utter frustration. The result was a stunning Allied victory. 3 U-boats sunk, another damaged, and not a single merchant ship lost. On board one of the sunken U-boats, U-954, was Admiral Dönitz's youngest son, Paul. He perished with the rest of his crew, a poignant and tragic reflection of the immense personal cost of this brutal warfare, even for those at the very top. The battle for SC-130 was the pinnacle of a truly terrible month for the Kriegsmarine, a month that would forever be known as Black May. In that single month, Dönitz lost a staggering total of 41 U-boats, almost 25% of his entire operational fleet. The numbers were unsustainable, the rate of attrition catastrophic. Kapitänleutnant Peter Erich Kremer, serving at U-boat staff headquarters, vividly recalled the horror. This May situation was quite out of hand. As I was soon to learn, the number of boats that failed to return from patrol reached more than one a day, and there was talk of Black May. On May 24th, facing the grim reality of unsustainable losses and a completely reversed tactical situation, a defeated Dönitz issued the unthinkable order. His U-boats were to withdraw from the Atlantic until better equipment and effective countermeasures against the new Allied technologies could be developed. The hunters had indeed become the hunted, and the turning point was absolute. So how did things go so catastrophically wrong, so fast, for the U-boats? The Allied developments, as we've explored, were certainly a monumental factor. But it's equally important to examine the profound, often overlooked German weaknesses that contributed to their stunning defeat. Firstly, and perhaps most crucially, the Germans suffered from poor intelligence regarding Allied capabilities. They were largely unaware of, or severely underestimated, the efficacy of technologies like high-frequency direction finding, HUF-DUF, the new 10-centimeter radar, and the extent of Allied Enigma decryption, ULTRA. U-boat command simply didn't grasp the scale of the technological leap the Allies had made. As a result, German submariners had no effective way to avoid these new threats or to compensate for them. They continued to operate under outdated assumptions, making them fatally vulnerable. Imagine a boxer, confident in his tried-and-true tactics, suddenly facing an opponent who has learned to read his mind and gained an invisible, debilitating new punch. That was the situation for the U-boats. Secondly, Dönitz's command philosophy, while often effective in its initial phases, proved to be a critical flaw. His top-down approach required constant radio reports from his U-boats, especially before and during an attack. This centralized control, while ensuring coordination for wolfpack tactics, also gave British Ultra and, more importantly, the ubiquitous HUF-DUF detection systems countless opportunities to locate them. During the decisive SC-130 battle, for instance, a staggering 104 HF-DF reports were logged, allowing the Allies to pinpoint the U-boats' exact positions with deadly accuracy. Every crackle of radio static, every brief transmission, became a homing beacon for Allied escorts and aircraft, sealing the fate of the U-boats. The very strength of their coordinated attack strategy became their greatest weakness in the face of evolving Allied technology. Thirdly, and shockingly, the Kriegsmarine suffered from a chronic lack of reliable air cover. Dönitz, acutely aware of the problem, repeatedly demanded more support from Hermann Göring's Luftwaffe. However, Göring, driven by personal ambition, rivalry, and a deep-seated belief in the primacy of land-based air power, stubbornly resisted diverting precious resources away from his own interests. He saw the Luftwaffe as a strategic air force, not a mere adjunct to the Navy. This internal squabbling within the Nazi high command had devastating consequences. Without consistent air patrols and reconnaissance to protect them, or to provide warning of approaching Allied aircraft, U-boats were constantly exposed on the surface, forced to dive, losing vital time, and often sustaining damage. The inability of the German armed forces to effectively integrate their air and naval assets was a strategic blunder of epic proportions. Furthermore, while the sheer number of U-boats at sea continued to increase, This didn't translate into a proportionate increase in sinkings. Indeed, the average kill per U-boat plummeted. By April 1943, the average tonnage sunk per U-boat per sea patrol had dwindled to a mere 2,000 tons. This was a stark contrast to the earlier happy times. As one Allied observer wryly noted, paraphrasing a famous anecdote, when Daniel Boone, who shot 50 bears a year, was replaced by 50 hunters who averaged one each, the bears saw no occasion to celebrate the decline in human marksmanship. The threat of numerous U-boats still worried the Allies, but their individual effectiveness was in precipitous decline. This brings us to perhaps the most poignant and tragic reason for the German defeat: the rapid deterioration of individual U-boat performance and, critically, the plummeting experience levels of their crews. In 1940, a U-boat commander typically possessed an average of 2 years' experience in submarine warfare, a seasoned veteran. By 1943, this had shrunk to a mere 8 months. The brutal attrition rate meant that newly commissioned captains, often fresh from training, were being thrown into the deadliest battlefield on Earth with minimal practical experience. Most U-boat captains killed in May 1943 had only 1 or 2 patrols to their name, hardly enough time to master the terrifying complexities of wolfpack tactics, evasive maneuvers, or the psychological toll of sustained combat. The aces of the early war, those exceptional commanders responsible for a disproportionate share of sinkings. In 1940, 2% of captains accounted for 30% of sinkings, all of whom had entered the Kriegsmarine before 1935, were largely gone by 1943, casualties of the relentless war. Roughly 850 U-boats, an astounding 75% of the total built and crewed during the entire war, would never damage an Allied merchantman. Their crews, often young, idealistic, and utterly dedicated, were sent to a watery grave with little to no chance of success. The statistics are chilling. In November 1940, the average tonnage sunk per U-boat per day was 430 tons. By January 1943, it had fallen to a mere 65 tons. This wasn't just a tactical failure. It was a systemic collapse, a human tragedy of immense proportions, where inexperienced crews were pitted against a technologically superior, rapidly adapting enemy. From 1939 until early 1943, the Atlantic had been the only theater in which Germany consistently maintained the offensive, a symbol of their maritime power. But now, even there, they were in full, undeniable retreat. Dönitz's withdrawal order in May 1943 was not meant to be permanent. He desperately hoped to fast-track new U-boat developments, more advanced designs, and to shift back to smaller, more elusive group tactics. But the U-boat wolfpacks, as a truly decisive strategic force, never made a meaningful return. Their moment had passed. Instead, the Atlantic, once a deadly gauntlet, slowly but surely transformed into the logistical superhighway for the Allied invasion of Europe. The tide had not merely turned, it had shifted irrevocably. 2 years after that Black May for the German U-boat fleet, the ultimate irony of history unfolded. Admiral Dönitz, the architect of the U-boat war, the man whose face adorned countless propaganda posters, found himself, by Adolf Hitler's final, deranged will, elevated to head of state and supreme commander of the armed forces of Nazi Germany. This grim promotion came after Adolf Hitler and Joseph Goebbels committed suicide in the Reichschancellery bunker, as the Red Army closed in on the shattered heart of Berlin during the climax of the Battle of Berlin. Dönitz, the fanatic, was left to preside over the ashes of a crumbling empire, a stark reminder that even the most dedicated of warriors can be consumed by the ultimate folly of a losing war. The Atlantic, a battle won, paved the way for the end. The story of Germany's defeat in the Battle of the Atlantic is more than just a historical account of ships and submarines. It's a profound lesson in the dynamics of warfare, a testament to how even the most formidable threats can be overcome through a combination of strategic foresight, rapid technological innovation, flexible tactical adaptation, and sheer human endurance. The primary takeaway from this epic struggle is the critical importance of adaptability and the integrated application of diverse solutions. Dönitz's U-boats were powerful, and his initial strategy was brilliantly effective against an unprepared enemy. However, the German High Command failed to adapt. They underestimated the Allied capacity for innovation, dismissed new technologies, and allowed inter-service rivalries to undermine critical cooperation, as seen with Göring and the Luftwaffe. Their intelligence faltered, becoming complacent and unable to track the rapid advancements of their adversaries. On the other hand, the Allies, despite their initial disarray and heavy losses, demonstrated a remarkable ability to learn, to pool resources, and to synthesize intelligence, technology, and tactics into a cohesive, overwhelming force. They didn't rely on a single silver bullet. Instead, they combined ultra-intelligence with advanced radar and sonar, integrated air and sea power, refined their convoy tactics, and built ships faster than the enemy could sink them. This integrated, multi-layered approach created a synergistic defense and offense that overwhelmed the U-boats. The Battle of the Atlantic also highlights the human cost and the psychological toll of prolonged warfare. On both sides, ordinary men faced unimaginable stress, fear, and brutal conditions. The terrifying claustrophobia of a U-boat under depth-charge attack, the bone-chilling cold of the North Atlantic on an escort vessel, the constant threat of a torpedo strike for a merchant sailor. These were realities that pushed the limits of human endurance. The decline in U-boat crew experience and the tragic loss of Dönitz's own son underscore the devastating human attrition that occurred, particularly on the German side in the latter stages of the battle. It's a stark reminder that even the most advanced machinery of war is ultimately operated by human beings, and their morale, training, and resilience are just as critical as the technology they wield. Finally, this story teaches us about the strategic imperative of supply lines and logistics. For Britain, the Atlantic was quite literally its lifeline. Without the constant flow of goods, its war effort would have collapsed. The desperate fight to keep those convoys moving, and the eventual success in doing so, proved that logistical superiority is often as decisive, if not more so, than battlefield victories. It enabled the build-up for D-Day and the eventual liberation of Europe. The Battle of the Atlantic was a harrowing, desperate fight, but it was also a triumph of ingenuity and perseverance. It's a powerful lesson that even in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds, innovation, collaboration, and an unyielding will to fight can ultimately turn the tide of history. It reminds us that victory is rarely about a single heroic act, but rather the cumulative effort of countless individuals, technologies, and strategic decisions woven together in the crucible of conflict. The gray wastes of the Atlantic hold many secrets, but none more profound than the story of how a global war was very nearly lost and then decisively won beneath its turbulent waves.